Plenty of studies say that other EU states, such as the UK and Germany, are better for startups. We'll put that aside for just a moment. We're going to find out what's wrong with France. And that was the question I put to Nick Stamenkovic from RIA Capital Markets.
Well, certainly there is a cyclical recovery underway in the euro area, albeit a modest one. And as you quite rightly pointed out, France, alongside Italy, are the laggards in the recovery so far. I think a lot of that is down to a lack of structural reforms, i.e. labour market reforms, product market reforms, and a general liberalisation of the economy. And as a result, it has lagged behind, particularly Germany and even the likes of Spain, which are seen as a bit of a poster child within the Eurozone economy. But, the jury's still out on France. The hope is that they will tackle some of these issues, and over time that will help the economy to catch up on some of its lost ground over the last few years.
Yeah, in the past few years since this crisis has begun in Europe, a lot of people were saying, look, Germany was strong, France was holding its own ground, things were relatively stagnant. But this consumer confidence and consumer spending out of France is a bit surprising to some, that we're seeing this sudden burst of weakness at a time when things are actually pretty good. And I'm wondering if you can comment on the timing of some of this data.
Yes, I think one of the factors for the French economy is the fact that the recent fall we saw in oil prices earlier this year, most of the benefit of that has probably fed through to consumers. So some of that now is sort of disappearing from the support from the consumer sector. On top of that, the unemployment rate in France is at a record high, and that must to some extent be making investors cautious, if not increasing their savings. But I think the outlook for consumer spending is actually not too bad. There's a tax cut coming later this month, and that should put money in people's pockets. And even though the unemployment rate is high, jobs are going to be created going forward. So I'm reasonably confident that consumer spending will pick up in the second half this year, and will be one of the few engines of growth for the French economy for this year.
There's been a major push, as you mentioned earlier, in terms of reforms. Two parts. One is on the retirement part. The other part is on those who are still working, this 35-hour work week situation. For those of us not familiar with the intricacies of the French economy, tell me why these two parts are important to you.
Well, for a long time, the trade unions in France have had significant power, and that's prevented any sort of significant reform, particularly in the labour market, which is crucial for improving productivity over the medium term. And various governments have tried to tackle this, and the trade unions are still extremely powerful, particularly in the public sector. Consequently, this government is trying to move forward, but the 35-hour week seems to be an area which the trade unions are not prepared to negotiate. If you go back to Germany and the so-called Hartz Commission 10 years ago, one of the key factors behind the improving outlook for the German economy over the last 10 years was the fact that labour market reforms took place, and the German economy benefited from that. That isn't happening yet, or not happening significantly enough or sufficiently enough in France for the French economy to make up for some of its lost ground that I mentioned earlier. But at least the French government is moving the right way, but it's doing it in a very slow process, and investors aren't particularly impressed at this juncture.
Yeah, and look, the patience of investors has been tested time and time again, especially in France. And I'm wondering if you feel that what Hollande is doing is, number one, fast enough, and number two, if you're confident that these reforms at the end of the day will actually be put in place.
Well, when Mr. Hollande came into power, he did completely the wrong thing. He raised taxes, he gave too much power to the unions, he put in some wrong policies. He's recognised that and reversed them. But he's lagged behind, well behind the likes of the Spanish authorities, where the Spanish economy is doing very well. So at least at last he's starting to put some of those reforms in place, albeit at a very slow pace. At the moment, we're not really seeing any signs of a shift in investor confidence. If you look at things like foreign direct investment, that's money or investment coming into the economy from outside, that has collapsed in the last few years. So for us to see signs that confidence is improving, we need to see evidence of foreign direct investment picking up, and investor confidence in general improving.
Recently, the economic minister in France said and insinuated essentially that it was the #1 place, speaking of France, for startups. I want to see if, #1, this is where they should focus on, is innovation and startups, and #2, if the economic minister is even correct.
Well, I mean, certainly that would be very encouraging if you could get more entrepreneurial spirit coming to the French economy. But if you look at the performance of business investment in the last few years, it's been pretty awful. business investment fell again in the second quarter and has been falling in the last few years. That certainly doesn't suggest to me that companies are sufficiently confident to boost capital investment. But if those measures take place and companies become more confident that the structural reforms are being implemented, then that long turnaround or long downturn in business investment might start to turn around.